Hello everybody, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Priya Kanchandani, editor of Icon magazine, and I'm pleased to introduce to you the subject, Kicking the Waste Addiction, How Design Can Change the Way We Consume. And this event is brought to you in partnership with Icon and also Aritco. Let me introduce our panel to start with. We've got some really fantastic experts on the subject of design and waste, which, as you know, is a really topical subject. Firstly, on my left is Emma Fromberg, Program Manager at the Institute for Sustainability Leadership at Cambridge University. This is Petra Lind, Product Manager at Aritco. And on my right is Sophie Thomas, who's apart from being a friend of Icon magazine, is a designer and expert in sustainability, been working in this field for many decades, really. And finally, Oliver Wilton, who's lecturer in environmental design at the Bartlett School of Design, which is part of UCL, and will be telling us a bit more about your work shortly. So why are we here today? I guess we all know that we are in some kind of planetary environmental crisis. I'm sure the experts sitting around me will be able to tell you a bit more about that. But to start off, to give you a bit of a context as to why the subject of waste is so urgent, I just wanted to read you a couple of statistics. Apparently, in 2017, Britain dumped 300,000 tons of clothes into landfill. In the same year, 295 billion pieces of plastic were apparently thrown away, and around 70% of that couldn't be recycled. So quite astonishing figures. I'm sure they're not so much of a surprise to you guys, but maybe to the rest of us. But as we all know, public awareness of this issue has been fast growing. We recently did an issue of Icon that was about waste and the circular economy and how design can offer solutions. And one of the things we featured as an Icon of the Month was Blue Planet, the BBC series, and specifically it was about the episode, which we probably all remember, that showed the oceans strewn with plastic. And we didn't really know how bad the situation was until we saw this. So I think since that point, there has really been a shift in public awareness that has allowed us really to have this conversation in forums like this. But turning to you guys, firstly, I wondered if you could give me a sense of how we ended up in this situation. Sophie, you've probably been working on this subject for the longest.
Oh God,
can you give us a sense
probably.
of how did we end up littering our planet to this degree? How did this become normal?
I don't know. I mean, you'd probably, some of the research that we did when we were working, so if any of you know about a project that I ran in 2012 to 2016 called The Great Recovery, which was about looking at the impact of design within a circular economy, what kind of role that designers play. And one of the research pieces that we did was to look back at when we started to come up with a concept of built-in obsolescence. And the furthest back I went was about to it was to America when they had the really, really big problems, massive depression, and they were looking at ways of trying to rebuild the economy. And in the early 1900s,
The Great Depression.
The Great Depression, thank you. That's where the Great Recovery came from. The name came from. So I should have remembered that. So
what did the Great Recovery entail?
Well, the Great Recovery was really looking at how we could build products that were built on keeping value in the system, recovering reuse, using recycling as a sort of last attempt at resourcing, at capturing the materials. It's about retaining value and how design can stop that and how design can encourage it. And one of the statistics was the Design Council statistics from the 80s was about 80% of the environmental impact of a product was predetermined at concept design stage. So as soon as we as designers started to put pencil to paper or to think about an idea, we're immediately locking in the length of that project, the length of that product, the life cycle of it, where that material would go, whether we were co-moulding it, whether we were mixing it in a way, whether we were thinking about how it be taken apart. And in the Great Depression, they were started to build policy around creating things that could get thrown away very quickly in order to encourage people to buy more stuff, to help the economy, to build factories that made more things. But what they didn't ever consider in that paper was about taking it back and taking it apart and using the materials and rebuilding again. So almost that by that point we had this idea of like things being used once. And this concept of disposability started to creep into everything, and now we have it in everything around us. So it used to be just in packaging, possibly. Now it's in mobile phones or in bigger pieces like, cars potentially, all these things that we actually get through very, very fast, much faster than we should do.
Thank you. One thing that I really wanted to ask you about was the toothbrush. We've had a conversation about this before, but how much waste is it that a toothbrush requires in order to be manufactured? It was absolutely shocking.
I can't remember, but I think we go through. There are 4 types of plastics in a normal disposable toothbrush generally, and there's usually metal as well. When we do tear downs of them, you really find them, and it's a product that has 4 months of use, and it has a 400-year lifespan. So I think in the US there's like 25,000 plus tons of toothbrushes thrown away every year, and they go into landfill because although actually they are recyclable, plastic is a recyclable material. Because of the way they're made, they're actually put together and you can't take them apart. So every toothbrush that is made goes into landfill.
Wow. Emma, I was wondering if you could tell us, like, what would you say are our biggest sources of waste? Like, what are the things that are accumulating in the ways that Sophie's just talked about?
Well, there are many industries that cause large volumes of waste, such as the built environment, basically all the buildings around us, but also fashion throughout its entire supply chain. So not only, the clothing that we dispose, but also in the making of the clothing, rivers are being polluted and factory laborers are being exploited. So many parts of the supply chain in fashion and the textiles industry is very unsustainable. And currently what is massively exploded now in the public eye is, of course, plastics and plastic waste. But there are many other sources of waste streams that should be addressed.
What sort of, because we kind of have a focus on plastics at the moment, we're obsessed with trying to reduce plastics. What are the other things we should be thinking about?
Well, I think how we construct buildings, that's like really large volumes of stuff, and concrete cannot be reused. I think electronics and rare materials, such as like all the little components in your printed circuit board that need to be there to make sure you can call with your phone and you can use all the features that a phone has. They need to come from all sorts of areas around the world, and there are not many locations where we can mine them. And often the people that are involved in mining them are working in very poor conditions. And after they end up in things like your phone, like your laptop, it's very difficult to take them apart and put them back in a printed circuit board, for example, again. And also then one more is would be batteries and electric vehicles. Lithium in batteries currently cannot be recovered at the end of its life cycle. So if we make a massive movement towards renewable energy and we want to use batteries to store that kind of energy, we need to find solutions on what kind of materials do we use in there and how do we make sure that the materials that support these systems can be used perpetually.
Okay, so there's many other sources of waste, of unsustainable waste, that we really need to be more conscious of, other than plastic.
Definitely.
Thank you. From the perspective of a product developer, I was wondering how these subjects resonate and how, through your practice, you've been trying to make the products, because you guys develop lifts and you've been doing some work to try to make them as sustainable as possible. Could you talk us through how these sort of subjects have resonated with you?
Yeah, it's a quite fascinating subject, I would say that, and to hear about all the waste that we throw away. Our policy is that we use natural and recyclable materials in our lifts, and today we can recycle more than 95% of our lifts. We still have some batteries in the lifts and plastic, but we try to minimize that. And we're always working on the process and on the products to find sustainable materials. Our lifts are mainly built of metal, because with the metal we can make the design we like to have. And metal, as aluminium and steel, you can recycle, and they are natural materials. We also use a lot of glass in our lifts. 12% of our lifts are made of glass, and with the glass we can get the design we like to have, and it's also recyclable and a natural material.
So, of course, the product is one aspect of that generates waste, but there's also the supply chain. What kind of work have you been doing to try to streamline that?
We are a Swedish lift manufacturer, so we manufacture all our lifts in Sweden. We try to work with the local suppliers as much as possible to minimize the transport time and also to know where the material comes from. And since we have the production ourselves, we can make sure that we recycle all the waste or packaging material in the production. As well as also when we transport our lifts, we can do that in a more sustainable way, making sure that we don't ship out lifts in an unsustainable way. Big lifts, we pack them smarter and so on. So we do a lot of things like that too.
Thank you. So that's all, I guess, an example of the way in which product developers can try to shift the current practice to try to use more sustainable materials and a more sustainable supply chain. But we'll come back to solutions, I think, shortly. But first, I wanted to get a sense from you, Oliver, of the extent of this issue in the context of architecture. Emma's already highlighted that the built environment is one of the worst culprits when it comes to generating waste. Would you agree with that? And if so, what can you tell us the extent of this issue?
Well, I guess what I can say about that is that the current design methods we use and the current purposes of buildings are quite limited in relation to material resources and keeping them in cycle and the avoidance of waste. Yeah? So current way we build has got an awful lot of complexity built into it, which has happened almost by accident, often through the pursuit of cheapness on quite narrow terms. And that can make it extremely difficult to actually recover materials and components for reuse at the end of the life cycle. It's just economically unviable. Also, the current design methodologies that many designers use are sort of inherited methods that get tweaked when certain compliance requirements and or other trends come in, but they aren't necessarily that fit for purpose given the sort of things, the way we should be doing things these days. And what I'd advocate certainly is adoption of a whole life approach to product, building component and building design, where rather than just to focus on the use, you're thinking about resources, manufacture, assembly, use, disassembly and reuse at the end of the life of the product. Yeah?
So which materials in particular are the worst culprits in terms of the built environment?
Well, it's hard to talk about one material being a culprit because it just depends on the exact use and how long it's in use and what happens to it at the end of the use.
Okay.
So in some ways to think about it in terms of materials it's not exactly a red herring, but it's more about fitness of purpose given the particular use. So obviously sometimes concrete can be a fantastic material, exactly what you should use from a sustainability perspective if the life cycle is such and the demands of its use are such that it's the right material to use. Yeah?
So,
but then sometimes because fossil fuels have given us cheap energy, and so materials like concrete and steel are quite cheap because energy is cheap. So in some respects, they find themselves into areas that perhaps there might be better materials to use from a sustainability perspective. But certainly, that I wouldn't identify them as culprits. That would be a real simplification. They're fantastic materials that can play a role.
That's quite an interesting perspective because in the media, I guess we've read a lot about concrete in the last year. And I think in Icon we also featured it as a design crime. But I guess today's session we're trying to talk more about shifting from that perspective to talking about a more circular economy. And when I told people we were doing this event who don't know about design, they asked me, what does that mean? Is that recycling? I was wondering how you guys would define it. Perhaps Sophie and Emma are best placed to tell us
I
what
think
that
from a
exactly
design
means?
perspective, circular economy is about making sure you get the most value out of the material. So if you're thinking about a product, the product is a little blip in the lifespan of the material. So the focus goes away from the product and into what you're making it with. And so if you took that point of view, you can actually then think, well, I've got to get that material back out again, separate it out from something else so that it can become something else. And that's when you start looking at, is it about longevity? Is it about disassembly? And you have to design for it. So I think the difference is, for designers, is that you move away from designing something into and looking at designing the system and the whole, when you talk about the whole life cost, the costing piece. And I think that's why something like a toothbrush is a really good example, actually, because here you are, you've got a product that has a 4-month life cycle, and you're using a material that has a 400-year life cycle, as well as best we know. So therefore, that I would say that was a complete mismatch of the use of it and the material life. And if you switch the way you think about it, you can then start designing for not just it to be recyclable, which is the first life, but you actually start thinking of the third and the fourth plus life, not of the product, but of the actual raw material that you're using. And then you can start thinking, well, concrete, okay, how do I use it so I get that full amount of embodied energy into use for as long as possible?
Thank you. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Emma, in terms of your approach to the circular economy, or how you might describe it in a design context.
Well, I think it's really important that designers start to look at as a designer by background, like look at your design not just in a vacuum of, what you're creating, just a toothbrush, but it connects with all sorts of stakeholders in the system. And this starts at production, of course, and getting your materials out of the ground or out of another product when you're talking about recycled content. And who is being exposed to that, and who is interacting with that, and what kind of spin-offs has it on the environment and on society. Many good things as well, because a toothbrush can keep your mouth healthy, and if you have pain or something, your human potential is wasted as well. So there are many good things about a toothbrush, but there are also many things that can be optimized, not just the material itself, but the entire system around the toothbrush or around your product. And I think designers are the perfect fit for complexity, because as a designer, you're trained to deal with a human, and a human is complex and a user is complex, and you start to understand your specific user while you're designing it, and you start to get to know it just well enough to design something that they love. And that's an amazing achievement if you look at complexity, to understand patterns and connections well enough to make something that is desirable. So that kind of attitude and that design attitude is really necessary in creating these solutions for a circular economy.
Thank you. I mean, I guess some of these ideas are new, but then at the same time, there has been a lot of discourse around the circular economy recently, and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has managed to get quite an impressive array of companies to sign up to a circular economy commitment. I was wondering if you guys had in mind any good examples of the use of circular economy in design that you might be able to describe to us, to give us a picture of how this can work in practice. Or do you think we haven't got that far yet?
I think it's really interesting, because there are so many people now using the phrase, and when we were doing the Great Recovery, we were always asked, when is it going to happen? And we're like, it's like you're basically talking about complete redefinition of an economy, and actually it's really difficult. But saying that, there are really good examples. I mean, I have to say things like, it's always about it depends. So a really good example could be the milk bottle, for instance. But then if you have to think about how many times you have to use a glass milk bottle in order to get that efficiency. So a lot of the time you go, yes, that's a really good example, but you have to contextualize it. So some of the best really good examples are in systems. So it's all about leasing. There's things like the new Loop system, which is coming in, has been launched in.
What's that?
So Loop is a new delivery system, a bit like the milk the milkman or the woman who used to come around to deliver your things, but that's looking at reusable packaging. So they've got lots of brands lined up now, and the person will come from, I think it's UPS or some delivery system, will come and deliver these products to you in these new reusable containers, and then you give them back and they refill them and then they bring them back. So it's very much like giving a glass milk bottle, getting it washed, put it refilled and bringing it back to you, but it's a home delivery system that uses reusable, because things like reusable packaging is really, really important for circular economy, and servicing and leasing is really, really important. So it's kind of like the system. We go back to the same examples like Philips lighting. So they're charging for, you're not buying a light bulb from them, you're buying light and the ability to see, and that kind of understanding that what your product is delivering rather than what you're actually creating is really important as well.
So it sounds like if we were to strive to a circular economy, there would need to be a shifted infrastructure, not just in attitudes and the way we use materials.
And a stronger connection between design and waste management, which is something I'm always banging on about, because actually if you as a designer don't know what happens to your thing after it's finished, i.e. you're not thinking about this kind of material focus, then you could say, I'm going to spend 5 years doing R&D on the most amazing keyboard, which can be disassembled when we're finished with it and taken back to its own little components and materials. But the reality of that is, in the UK particularly, all of our e-waste goes into a crusher, gets separated, gets taken to somewhere where they burn off the plastic to get all the major metals off it, and they siphon them off. That's how they get the materials back. So designing a disassembled, really good thing, spending all that time and that effort and design on one thing, whereas actually not understanding how it's going to be recovered in the UK.
That's interesting.
Is really the wrong way to think about it. So you really have to know about what happens to things at the end of life.
I'd just like to say these approaches aren't new. They used to be the prevalent approaches before the Industrial Revolution. So another good place to look is just far enough back to see how systems used to work when they were resource poor. So there are plenty of examples out there on that. A really simple example is when I went to Bali, I was told that food used to be wrapped in leaves there, and when people finished, they just threw them back into the landscape and they just biodegraded and it started again. And they now have a problem when you drive around Bali, you see quite a lot of plastic bags dotted around the landscape. The reason that's happened is because the bags are quite useful and they got so inexpensive that people started to use them instead of leaves, but there's no municipal waste system for, there, and they just still throw them into the sidewalk. So you can look backwards as well.
It's quite interesting that those sorts of models are now being held as examples, because during the Industrial Revolution, when also Britain was at the centre of progress, so to speak, but also the centre of empire, those nations were seen and kind of framed as being backward.
That's a really important
point. How do we overcome
this? Well, that's
it?
a really important point. It still exists, actually. I mean, a lot of buildings in Africa are built using outdated Western building codes out of concrete, and one of the reasons is because the traditional methods are seen as, in some instances, not prestigious, whereas actually a lot of the traditional methods out there are actually very sophisticated, tailored to climate, and very suited to environmental sustainability as well. So there's a big cultural issue there about what people want, how people want to present themselves, their lifestyle, what's seen as progressive
really
in a particular place.
But I guess your example, Petra, earlier kind of shows that these ideas can be implemented in a commercial context, and they don't necessarily mean going backwards. Would you agree?
The lift can live for 20 to 30 years. So we need to work with materials that are long-lasting in our products, and as I said, and with natural and recyclable materials.
I think longevity of materials is a really important point, and one crucial aspect of the circular economy.
Yes, but also you can see, but not if you have to go. I think the thing is you have to go like brief or product by product in a weird way. So if you're talking about packaging, then longevity is not useful, particularly unless you're going for reuse. So the loop model is very much about reuse, making sure you get the maximum amount of use of a stainless steel or a kind of ceramic. But in terms of single life plastic, you definitely don't want longevity.
Okay.
So we used to work on a system where we would sort of put the product in the middle and work out kind of different models of how you design it even before you start designing it. Am I designing it for to go around the system really quickly, get recycled back into a material that can be reused? Am I looking at compostable, which is a big, hairy old problem, challenge at the moment? Am I looking at something that I get back, reuse, constantly get back? So you really have to think about, that's what I'm saying, you have to think about the system you're designing for, and you sort of plonk your product in the middle and then work around it before you even start designing it, because then you'll choose the right materials, you'll talk to the right people, you'll bring in the right, you'll bring in the right R&D and innovation around that.
So this needs to be built right into our design education system, really.
It's also just it's also a fundamental question about how the user perceives. I mean, there's a whole outdated terminology. We're talking about consumers, but to consume means to use and to destroy through use. Yeah.
What do you think we should say instead?
If you're going to have a tomato, obviously you destroy it through use. If you have a consumable like possibly a bicycle tire, it's a consumable. But we need to think about products. When consumers, as we call them now, think about themselves as users and perhaps owners of something for a certain period of time, and they start to develop desires about what happens after that, then that will be a powerful driver for change. And say if it's a phone, it's one thing because that's within a timescale that you can comprehend. In buildings, there are other challenges because you're asking people often to talk about what happens after they're dead, and it's just not something that we address much in this society. You don't really think about, I really want something good to happen to that a long time after I've died, and that, so in construction there are a whole load of timescale issues around that which are quite interesting,
Before we ask you guys if you have any questions for the panel, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how we move forward. I guess there's like a turning point and shift of awareness about the need for a more circular economy, but the actual change is still quite niche. Probably. How do we move forward and embed this issue, right at the centre of, of where it needs to be, i.e., at the innovation stage and within design education?
I currently at Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, we are actually looking at developing education for business leaders to create this strong vision around what the direction should be of their company and of their organization and how to get there and get buy-in within their organization. So I think a really important step towards making a change is getting the right business leadership on board, as well as also leadership within governments and cities and on every scale in how we organize society. I think that currently there is so much awareness already in wider society. You have school kids going on the streets. This is a big sign of things to also kind of go, bottom up as well. And hopefully we will get the right people in the right places to make such a paradigm shift, because it will honestly affect human life in the most profound ways that we can imagine to really make this shift.
Do you guys have anything to add about the future of this, how we move forward
Well,
from
I
here?
think it's going to, realistically, it'll be a mixture of incremental improvements and adjustments to help shift systems in broadly a positive direction of travel, and also opportunity for some more radical paradigm shift work, and that's what we tried to do on Cork House, which I'm one of the architects for, where we tried to design from scratch, thinking about environmental sustainability principles and thinking about the building at each stage of its life. And so it was a kind of question and interest-driven project that went through 3 years of research, and then we designed a building which is certainly very different to your average building these days. So it's going to be a mixture of both things, really.
So that's Cork House, which is a project that you've been working on along with a group of architects.
Yeah, Matthew Barnett Howland and Dido Mill, but we also undertook a 3-year research project. Yeah.
So what is it about Cork that
we were just
made it the
looking
material
as a
of
way to
choice?
simplify construction and to develop a system that could be easy to assemble and disassemble and self-buildable, and we just identified expanded cork as a material that has an unusual combination of properties that potentially could do all of those things that you normally do with maybe steel, foam insulation, timber cladding, and we developed a simple, basically like a plant-based Lego type system with a building envelope which is just cork blocks. So that was an example. But that's fun, but it's not going to be the thing that everybody starts doing. There's there's going to be a mixture of minor adjustments and improvements and attempts at more radical changes, some of which turn out to have a future and some of which don't. And but it's an interesting field to be involved in if you're a designer and you're interested in creating, because it sets out some big open challenges and questions which are exciting to respond to. It's not business as usual. Yeah.
Just for the benefit of our audience, can you just explain where Cork House is? And
well, it's a small house in Eton, of all places, on a small island in the Thames. Yeah, and it's basically, the unusual thing about it is that we undertook a research project to develop this new form of construction, and we then had the opportunity to implement the first pilot project straight away afterwards, which is Cork House. So it's a combination of research and design, and it's an example of how designers, in this case architects and engineers, if you're given a broader opportunity to work more broadly across the resource, supply, manufacture chain, you can actually maybe use some of the skills and abilities you've got to work in teams and to answer some big questions to broader effect, going back down the manufacturing chain. So that's an interesting area, I think, to think about architects working with manufacturers to change systems.
Change the system. Yeah, thank you. Sophie, did you want to add?
So, I suppose because I've been working in sustainable design and circular economy for about 20 years, I kind of get to the point where I'm having the same conversations with people a lot over that time. And actually, I'd quite like to see the design...
Like a circular conversation.
A circular conversation. I'd like to see the design industry become a lot more radical. If we have a climate declaration, a climate emergency declaration now being done, actually the architects, structural engineers have all declared it. I haven't seen the design industry, the product design industry, the graphic design industry that I come from declare it. And circular economy is one of the solutions that we can do, because the way that we mine our resources, the way that we use our resources are massive drains on everything on this earth. We are making the climate emergency is really about resource use. And I always go back to Victor Papanek, who wrote Design for the Real World, and he said that designers persuade people to buy things they don't need with money they don't have to impress people they don't like. And I think if we really want to change what we do, we have to start teaching change the way we teach design. We have to stop working purely on aesthetic levels and really understand and work with our supply chains and really fundamentally shift this kind of static place. I think we're a bit rabbit in the headlights at the moment. We know there's an issue. We're kind of panicking, or we're not panicking, that's probably another. We know we've got to do something. We don't really know what to do, that's the problem. I would like to see a lot more policy engagement with the industry. There is a lot coming up. If our government gets back on track and we start working with policies again, there's a massive waste strategy and resource strategy that's been written in this government, and there's a huge bit in it about producer pays. So basically, if anyone produces something and they will have to pay for the way that their product is recovered, recycled, reused, whatever. That's never happened before, and that's quite radical. And that means the way that it is designed has to fundamentally change, because it's going to become really expensive to chuck stuff away. And are we ready for that as an industry? I just don't think we are. I don't think we are. And I would really like to see that to shift.
Well, there are other ways in which businesses kind of pay for things beyond the product, i.e. by paying tax. We're inadvertently kind of investing in the infrastructure that we use in business. We're inadvertently paying for the healthcare that supports our staff and things like that. So in a sense, making waste and making the way we use materials embedded within that system, making us feel vested in the way we use things, kind of makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and it will make everyone become very efficient with their materials.
I think if there was a monetary tag attached to waste, things would change drastically overnight. But I wanted to allow a bit of time for you guys to ask the panel questions. It would be fantastic to have some questions from you. Yes. The question was, could we talk a bit about the problems with compostables?
I think it's very interesting. There's a government, they've just called an expression, they've asked for interest, and they're having a debate about it, aren't they, about biodegradables and compostables. Currently, and I think this goes back to my point of education, the technology in, particularly in plastics, let's talk about, and the biodegradable side of plastics, is moving quite quickly. And because we're having this backlash against plastic as a material, a lot of products are going into the biodegradable area. The problem with that is we don't have the recovery system set up. So in the UK, our industrial composting system is not built to deal with the types of, if the kind of quantity of plastic we could be coming on. So for instance, if you use a bit of packaging and it's a biodegradable plastic, if you put it into the recycling bin, the recycling guys will probably not take the whole of that recycling because they're not set up to take it, so it will end up in the landfill or incineration. So what worries me is that we see this backlash coming out in the design, the way that we design things. So designers are switching their materials to a biodegradable plastic like a PLA or similar, and they haven't really talked about if it's widely recyclable, and so we're ending up with this kind of greenwash going on actually, and it worries me as a user and a citizen when I see it discussed. But I think they say put it in this bin, and I'm like, I know for a fact I can't put it in that bin. I can't put it in that bin because it will get chucked away. So where the hell do I put it?
But I do think that this is design actually panicking, because it basically gave plastic this awful name. Like, we all hate plastics, right? Because we associate this now with plastics in the ocean, the turtles and like the straws and stuff. It's horrible. But plastic itself, if you put it in the right context, it's amazing. It's such an amazing material. We can dye it, we can shape it. It is strong, it is flexible. There are so many qualities that we can engineer and that can support us in all kinds of sectors. Like, plastic is a truly amazing product, and once we start to see the value of something like that, and we understand that we need to get it back and put it back in the system again and know what is in there, because it's not just PET in bottles. We add so many chemicals in there that make us all really sick, and once they end up in the environment in microplastics, they make the environment really sick too. So once we start to design with pure and good materials and use them over and over again and keep track of them and make sure that there is actually a global system in place to facilitate that, then we can all enjoy all the benefits of plastic. So it's not all bad. And moving into the compostables is a panic reaction, and I believe it's quite dysfunctional. In some areas, it's a very good movement to go towards biodegradable or compostable, but in some areas, we really need to look at the infrastructure or what kind of material is suitable for this in that place with that kind of user, and how do we get it back?
Really interesting question we could continue talking about for much longer, but it'd be great to take one last question.
I'm just thinking about labelling the different components of the materials in the product or the building or whatever, when they finally come to disassemble the buildings or the products, that people at the end of its life know what's in it and are able to use it in whatever way it can be used. I think that's something that's missing at the moment as well. The fact that we don't know what's in some of the products or buildings. And
so the question was about labelling, and can labels help us identify what to do with different components of products at the end of their life?
Yeah, I mean, in buildings, in theory, a new building will have an operation and maintenance manual that'll tell you all that sort of stuff in nice, straightforward language. Yeah? So if we get to the point where they are straightforward and direct and easy to use and accessible, then you've got an arrangement there that should enable that. In reality, there's not enough time and money allowed to carefully assemble them, and they are quite difficult to decode. Yeah, but there is a kind of arrangement there that could work quite well for buildings. Yeah.
I always like the fact that, this is the BIM model. So I was having a conversation about somebody going, okay, you put together a really great instructional manual when you finish the building, and then about 2 years later they do a strip out, or some guy comes and fixes the wall. And the problem is that you really have to keep on top of it, don't you? You have to make sure that all of that is added to make sure that... And then the question, I think that product design has a lot to learn actually from architecture, because of the way that there have been sustainable codes in architecture for a while, where there's nothing, and in product design, particularly. There's no way of knowing. I bet half of you don't know what's in a toothbrush. But, in that sense, so actually it's really hard, and as a consumer, I'm told, this is what the hell do I put, where do I put this product? I just don't know what to do with it. And I think that's one of the problems about a lot of the new biodegradable plastics that are coming online, is that they look exactly the same as a normal plastic. So you're going, if you actually put that into the recycling bin, you contaminate the recycling. So I think as designers, we also have to work out how to help users identify what these materials are in the same way. And actually, the thing that will do that is technology. And that's the one that's really pushing and advancing circular economy at the moment, I think. I don't know if you know that.
Yeah, there is a massive tension field in like IP, intellectual property, around materials and the supply chain, and then and recyclers. So if you look at the original equipment manufacturer, they often say, it's fine for other people to recycle our content. Our content is recyclable. You can recycle our content. But we're not going to recycle anything of that, or we are not going to use anybody else's recycled content because we don't know what is in there. And especially now with legislation progressing, so a lot of horrible chemicals that make us very sick are now, through legislation, we're forced to design that out now. But if you use old materials and maybe the case of your laptop from 6 years ago, maybe that still contains that specific chemical, and then you're still keeping that in that material flow. So it's incredibly important to get an information structure in there that is actually locked through technology that respects the IP and respects all the desires from that part of the value chain, and then but still offers like an overview of all the components and all the chemicals and all the materials that are in that specific bit. That's a massive gap, and I hope that's going to be filled up with a new industry or company soon.
Great, thank you so much. It's been a really, really rich discussion today. I think we unanimously have agreed that the circular economy is an imperative moving forward, but I think it's quite complex in terms of how to make it happen, and the education and an understanding of how this can be possible at a consumer level but also an industry level is going to be really crucial moving forward. Thank you so much to the panel for taking part. Thank you to our partners Aritco. Thank you again for joining us. Bye.